They found him sitting by a roaring hearthfire, warm and fed, while the rest of the valley was entombed under 3 inches of solid, unbreakable ice. But 6 months earlier, the same men who now begged at his heavy oak door had driven him to the edge of the settlement with nothing but mocking laughter and cruel words. His name was Jedidiah Boone, 52 years old, a widower and former blacksmith, a man who listened to the deep rumble of the mountain when no one else would. This is the story of how one man's so-called foolishness became the only thing standing between 100 souls and a frozen, unyielding death. If you know in your heart that calloused hands and quiet faith built everything worth keeping, drop a comment below. Where are you listening from this evening? And if this tale already has a hold on you, hit like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories from the deep hollows. Now wrap that blanket tighter and stay close. The night is young and the story runs deep. Down in the lower settlements of Miller's Hollow, where the 1893 timber boom had brought new money and new arrogance, the townsfolk whispered that old Jed had finally lost his mind. Ever since his wife Sarah was taken by diphtheria 3 winters past, he had retreated up the steep, jagged incline of Black Bear Ridge, while the wealthy lumber barons and the town's mayor, Silas Vance, built grand wooden houses with weak tin roofs. Jedidiah was digging. He didn't build a proper barn. He didn't construct a traditional log cabin like a sane man. Instead, he swung his broadaxe and pick, carving a massive hole straight into the side of the Limestone Bluff. "Look at the old badger, digging his own grave," Mayor Vance would say, puffing on cured tobacco while pointing his silver-tipped cane toward the ridge. The men outside the general store would erupt in laughter, their boots resting comfortably on the boardwalk. They possessed steam engines and steel rails. They believed they had tamed the Appalachian wilderness. They saw Jedidiah as a pathetic relic of a dying age, a madman burrowing into the dirt like a frightened groundhog. Jedidiah never answered back. He just wiped the thick sweat from his brow, his massive forearms trembling from the strain, and kept hauling heavy limestone rocks to line the walls of his hillside cellar. He swung the pick with the rhythmic, thudding precision of a master blacksmith. Each strike against the earth was a testament to a quiet resolve. The sun beat down mercilessly, the summer haze clinging to the hemlock and hickory trees like a damp woolen blanket. Yet he worked on. His overalls were stained with mud, his hands cut and bleeding, bound in old rags. By his side sat Copper, his loyal coonhound, a scarred and quiet companion who offered the only solace Jedidiah needed. Copper would lie in the shade of a white oak, his ears twitching at the sound of every strike, standing guard against the creeping shadows of the dense laurel hells. He had seen the signs that the men in the valley chose to ignore. The woolly bear caterpillars had black bands wider than any he had ever seen. The gray squirrels were hoarding hickory nuts with a frantic, desperate energy, burying them deeper than usual. The bark on the north side of the white oaks was growing unusually thick. The red foxes were retreating higher up the ridge, their coats thick and heavy, and the air, even in the heat of the Indian summer, carried a faint metallic scent of deep frost, a whisper of a silver thaw that would shatter the world. Jedidiah Boone listened. While the valley of Miller's Hollow celebrated the autumn harvest with careless, gluttonous abundance, Jedidiah Boone was consumed by the grueling rhythm of the earth. The townsfolk were feasting, slaughtering their hogs early and consuming their winter stores far too quickly, blinded by the false warmth of an Indian summer. Down below, the distant glow of oil lamps and the faint, lively scraping of a fiddle drifted up on the wind, a sharp contrast to the solitary rhythmic thud of a broadaxe echoing across the ridge. Jedidiah was completely alone, save for Copper, but he was far from idle. He was building his sanctuary, a massive hillside root cellar that would defy the coming wrath of nature. The earth was unforgiving, stubbornly resisting every strike of his heavy iron pick. He spent weeks carving into the limestone bluff, creating a deep cavernous space that would maintain a constant life-saving temperature, even when the world above froze solid. He knew that to survive what was coming, a simple hole would not suffice. He began the agonizing process of dry stone walling, gathering flat, heavy stones from the creek bed and stacking them with meticulous precision. He didn't use modern mortar. Instead, he relied on gravity, friction, and an old Cherokee technique passed down through generations. He interlocked the jagged edges of limestone, building thick, unyielding walls that breathed just enough to prevent rot, yet stood strong enough to bear the crushing weight of the ridge above. Every stone he lifted sent a jolt of fire through his aging spine, but the steady panting of copper nearby gave him the silent encouragement he needed. To insulate this fortress, he used chinking and daubing, mixing thick, sticky red clay with river moss and coarse animal hair. He packed this heavy mud into the deepest crevices of the stones, sealing out the biting winds that would soon howl down the hollows. He reinforced the earthen roof with thick trunks of white oak, hewing the massive logs flat with his broadaxe. His calloused hands moved with the memory of a lifetime spent at the anvil, expertly notching the corners so the logs locked together like the interlocking fingers of a desperate prayer. Over the logs, he piled layers of hemlock branches, dried leaves, and packed earth, ensuring not a single draft could penetrate his subterranean haven. Every blister on his hands was a promise made to the mountain. He remembered the solemn, weathered face of his grandfather, a man who had survived the great freezes of a forgotten era. His grandfather used to sit by the open hearth, whittling a piece of hickory with an old draw knife, his voice raspy from years of breathing wood smoke. "The mountain gives, Jedi," his grandfather would say, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "But it only gives to those who bleed for it. The wind has no mercy for a proud man. When the air tastes of iron, you dig deep." Jedidiah closed his eyes, recalling the sharp, resinous smell of pine needles and the warmth of that old fire. With the structure sound, Jedidiah focused heavily on his victuals, knowing a cellar was worthless if it held no sustenance. He spent grueling days foraging in the dense laurel hells, his old brogans crunching over dry leaves as he sawed out wild ginseng, resilient Jerusalem artichokes, and tough hickory nuts. Copper trailed right behind him, sniffing the musty, damp earth and alerting Jedidiah to hidden patches of wild leeks and late-season elderberries. The dog was a constant companion in the biting isolation, offering a warm body to rest a hand upon when the silence of the woods grew too heavy. Inside the cellar, he constructed sturdy shelves from split poplar wood, using his froe and a wooden mallet. The smell of fresh-cut timber mingled with the damp earth. Then began the relentless work of preservation. He had hunted a large black bear earlier in the season, and now he dedicated himself to the arduous task of curing and smoking the meat. He rubbed coarse salt and crushed black pepper into the thick slabs of bear meat, hanging them high in a small external smokehouse he had fashioned from scrap tin and hickory logs. The rich, pungent scent of sizzling bacon fat and rendering lard permeated his coarse flannel shirt, a smell of pure, undeniable survival.
I miss you.
The preservation didn't stop at meat. The true heart of Appalachian survival lay in the mason jars. He spent countless nights by his roaring hearthfire, boiling glass jars in a massive cast-iron kettle. He meticulously canned rich dark apple butter, stirring the enormous copper pot for hours until it reduced into a thick, caramelized paste. He packed crock after crock with shredded cabbage and coarse salt, pressing it down with a heavy river stone to make fermented kraut. He prepared quarts of soup beans and rich sorghum molasses, sealing them tight against the rot. By late November, the walls of his root cellar were lined with rows of glass that shone like precious gems in the dim, golden light of his kerosene lamp. It was a cathedral of sustenance, built on sweat and foresight. The work was brutal, pushing his aging body to the absolute brink. One late afternoon, while dragging a massive stone to reinforce the cellar's heavy oak door, his grip slipped. The heavy limestone slab tumbled backward, crushing his left boot and pinning his foot to the hard-packed earth. A sharp, searing pain shot up his leg, forcing a guttural groan from his dry throat. Copper barked frantically, digging at the earth around the stone. He was miles from the nearest hearth, utterly isolated. Panic flickered in his chest, but he forced it down. Using an old oak branch as a lever, he gritted his teeth and heaved with all his remaining strength, finally rolling the stone away. His foot throbbed violently, the leather of his boot torn, but nothing was broken. He bound his foot tightly with a ragged bandana, ignoring the agonizing ache, and limped back to his work. The mountain did not care about pain. It only respected endurance. The air around the peak began to taste sharp and metallic. The sky bruised into a deep, sickly purple, and the temperature plummeted with unnatural speed. The false warmth of the Indian summer was brutally stripped away, replaced by a biting, suffocating cold that numbed the skin and froze the breath. The red foxes retreated to their dens, and the whippoorwill ceased its song. Down in the valley, the fiddle music abruptly stopped, replaced by the nervous murmurs of men who realized their tin roofs offered little protection against the creeping chill. Up on the ridge, Jedidiah Boone called Copper inside. He dragged the heavy, insulated oak door of his cellar shut, securing the thick iron latch he had forged himself. He banked the fire with thick ashes to keep the coals alive through the long night. The time for preparation was over. The winter was coming to collect its dues. It struck in the dead of the night, not with a howl, but with a terrifying, suffocating silence. A massive wall of freezing rain descended from the northern peaks, coating the world in a thick, unyielding layer of solid ice. This was the dreaded Silver Thaw, a beautiful, deadly phenomenon where the rain froze upon impact, transforming the Appalachian wilderness into a brittle, glass-like prison. The temperature plummeted so fiercely that the sap in the ancient oak and hickory trees froze instantly, causing the massive trunks to crack and split with a deafening noise that sounded exactly like musket fire echoing through the hollows. Down in Miller's Hollow, the arrogance of the modern age was brutally shattered. The grand wooden mansions built by the lumber barons were no match for the immense weight of the ice. The weak tin roofs groaned, then buckled, collapsing inward under the crushing pressure. The town's new steam-powered sawmill, a proud symbol of their supposed mastery over the mountain, was frozen solid, its iron gears locked in a glittering tomb. Panic swept through the settlement like wildfire. Food stores that had been carelessly left exposed in thin wooden sheds were entombed in inches of solid ice. Cattle and mules that had been left in the open fields, ignored by careless owners who trusted the Indian summer, were frozen stiff where they stood. Men who had laughed in the sunshine now shivered in the dark, their delicate oil lamps providing pitifully little warmth against a cold that seemed to seep directly into their bones. The valley was plunged into a desperate, freezing chaos. But up on Black Bear Ridge, perched high above the catastrophe, Jedidiah Boone was entrenched in his hillside root cellar. The storm raged outside, battering the thick oak door with relentless fury, but the subterranean walls of the earth and dry stone held strong. The temperature inside remained remarkably steady, a quiet testament to the ancient wisdom he had honored. He sat in an old wooden chair by his roaring hearthfire, wrapped in a heavy wool capote, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot chicory coffee. At his feet, Copper lay curled in a tight ball, occasionally twitching his ears as a distant tree branch snapped like a gunshot. The rich, salty smell of cured pork and dried roots filled the small space, a stark contrast to the freezing starvation unfolding below. The flickering flames cast long, comforting shadows across the rows of canned goods, the smoked venison jerky hanging from the rafters, and the crocks of apple butter. The mountain had unleashed its wrath, and Jedidiah was securely sheltered in its deep, earthen embrace. Yet the isolation was absolute. The silence of the storm, broken only by the horrific cracking of timber outside, pressed against his mind. It was a temable, heavy silence, a breathless pause in the natural order.
What is it?
Even the most meticulous preparations are tested by the mountain. On the third day of the relentless storm, a massive ice-laden branch from a dying hemlock tree snapped with a thunderous crack, plummeting directly onto the external chimney vent that Jedidiah had carefully constructed. The impact crushed the stone flue, blocking the exhaust completely. Within moments, thick, choking wood smoke began to fill the tightly sealed cellar. Jedidiah coughed violently, his eyes watering as the acrid smoke burned his lungs. Copper began to whine in panic, pacing nervously near the door. The fire, starved of oxygen and unable to vent, began to smother. The precious heat rapidly faded, and the biting, gnawing cold of the storm immediately sought to invade. Desperation clawed at his chest. If he opened the main oak door to vent the smoke, the sub-zero wind would instantly freeze his supplies, kill the dog, and extinguish the fire completely. If he left it shut, they would both suffocate in their own sanctuary. His hands, though calloused and strong, trembled as the temperature inside the cellar plummeted. Water in a tin bucket near the door began to glaze over with a thin film of ice. He fell to his knees, coughing up dark soot, the taste of iron thick in his mouth. He was fading. The storm was finding a way to claim him. He had to improvise. Remembering a trick he used in the blacksmith forge to clear slag from a stubborn flue, he grabbed a heavy iron rod and his heaviest sledgehammer. Wrapping his face in a damp bandana, he ordered Copper to stay low near the floor where the air was marginally cleaner. Jedidiah crawled through the blinding smoke toward the back wall of the cellar, where the blocked vent pipe connected to the surface. With lungs screaming for air and eyes burning like fire, he swung the sledgehammer in the confined space, striking the iron rod against the blockage. Once, twice, 3 times. His muscles burned, his vision spotting with black edges. The cold was seeping through his thick wool socks, numbing his toes. With a final roaring heave, driven by sheer, unadulterated willpower, he struck the iron rod with everything he had. The compacted ice and broken stone gave way. A rush of freezing, pure air blasted down the pipe, immediately sucking the toxic smoke up and out into the storm. Jedidiah collapsed onto the hard dirt floor, gasping hungrily for the clean, freezing air. Copper rushed over, licking his soot-stained face with frantic affection. Slowly, painstakingly, Jedidiah dragged himself back to the hearth. He fed dry hickory splinters to the dying embers, blowing gently until the fire roared back to life, its warm glow illuminating the tight stone-walled space. He huddled close to the flames, his chest heaving, his body aching in places he didn't know existed. The storm continued its brutal assault outside, howling and thrashing against the earth, but the cellar remained unbroken. He had looked the beast in the eye, and he had survived. The mountain was testing him, and he had proven worthy of its brutal mercy. When the freezing rain finally ceased and the brutal winds began to die down 14 agonizing days later, Miller's Hollow was a landscape of absolute devastation. The majestic Appalachian forest had been reduced to a graveyard of shattered, ice-coated timber. The arrogant town, once bustling with the noisy pride of industry, was utterly silent, paralyzed by a cold that had claimed both livestock and hope. The lumber baron's grand houses were fractured shells, their steam engines useless hunks of frozen iron. A group of half-starved townsmen, led by a pale, shivering Mayor Vance, made the grueling, agonizing trek up the treacherous incline of Black Bear Ridge. Their boots crunched miserably through the thick crust of ice. Their faces were gaunt, their proud, expensive coats reduced to ragged, frozen stiffness. They had scoffed at the old ways, trusting their wealth to shield them from the mountain's fury. Now their money was worthless. They were making the steep climb expecting to find the old blacksmith's frozen corpse, hoping merely to salvage any meager scraps of food or firewood he might have left behind. They walked in the terrible, silent shame of men who knew they were defeated. As they crested the ridge, struggling against the biting wind, they stopped dead in their tracks. They smelled it. Above the sharp scent of pine needles and ice, there was the rich, unmistakable scent of wood smoke and roasted meat drifting through the freezing air. It was a smell of life, of impossible survival. They staggered toward the hillside, where the thick oak door of Jedidiah's root cellar stood firm against the frozen earth, surrounded by a mountain of glittering shattered ice. Mayor Vance, his hands shaking uncontrollably from hypothermia and fear, raised a weak, trembling fist and knocked on the heavy timber. Inside, Jedidiah heard the faint thud. Copper let out a low, questioning growl. Jedidiah rose slowly, his joints stiff from the damp cold, and unlatched the heavy iron bar.
Almost there.
The door groaned open, revealing a rush of glorious, life-saving heat that hit the freezing townsman like a physical blow. There stood Jedidiah Boone. He was covered in soot, wearing his faded overalls and a thick wool shirt, weary to his bones, but his eyes were clear, calm, and unbroken. Behind him, the fire crackled warmly on the hearth, illuminating the heavy crocks of food, the rows of preserved mason jars gleaming like gold, and the thick slabs of cured meat hanging from the ceiling. The townsmen stared, completely dumbfounded, their breath pluming in the cold air. They had mocked him. They had called him a fool, a madman, a relic of a dying age. They had driven him into isolation with their cruelty. Now they stood before him, utterly humbled, expecting the old man to turn them away to freeze in the wasteland they had brought upon themselves. Mayor Vance couldn't even meet his gaze, staring instead at the tips of his ruined, frozen boots. Jedidiah looked at the shivering men. He saw their gaunt bodies, their ashamed, downcast eyes, and the sheer, acute desperation etched into their frostbitten faces. He felt no anger, no triumphant desire for vengeance. The mountain had already taught them a lesson far harsher than any words he could offer. Nature had delivered its righteous indignation. He remembered his late wife, Sarah, and the gentle wisdom she always carried. She used to say that a man's true wealth wasn't in what he hoarded, but in what he could provide when the world turned dark. He simply stepped back, opening the heavy door wider, the warm glow of the fire spilling out onto the unforgiving ice. "The mountain has a long memory," Jedidiah said quietly, his voice raspy but steady, echoing with a solemn peace. "But it also teaches forgiveness. Come on in by the fire." They sat in the dim warmth of the cellar, in absolute, silent shame. The wealthy men who had once ridiculed his calloused hands now eagerly accepted the simple, life-sustaining bowls of pinto beans, salt pork, and hot cornbread he handed them. They ate the victuals they had once deemed peasant food as if it were a feast fit for kings. Copper sat nearby, watching them calmly, leaning against Jedidiah's leg. Jedidiah watched them from the corner, his weathered face completely still. He offered no lectures, no "I told you so." He offered only the quiet, profound mercy of a man who understood that pride is a terrible blanket to wear in the dead of winter. The arrogant had been broken by the very wilderness they believed they had conquered, and their survival now rested entirely in the hands of the man who had respected the old ways. Weeks passed, and the brutal ice slowly began to yield to the gentle, inevitable thaw of spring. The valley below would take years to rebuild, their modern structures rotting and broken. But on the ridge, the earth remained solid. The surviving townsfolk returned to the valley, fundamentally changed by the freezing darkness they had endured. They never mocked the old ways again. When the first green shoots of wild leeks pushed through the softening mud, they looked at the mountain, not with greedy ambition, but with a deep, solemn reverence. The story of Jedidiah Boone and his hillside cellar echoed through the hollows for generations. It served as a stark reminder that true survival doesn't shout for attention. It waits patiently in the shadows, built with calloused hands, quiet faith, and ancient knowledge, ready when the modern world falls apart. Because the truth of the mountain is simple. Nature doesn't care about the size of your bank account, the fine cut of your clothes, or the height of your roof. It only respects the depth of your roots and the strength of your resolve. Thank you for joining us by the fire today. Until next time, keep your axes sharp, your pantries full, and your fires burning bright. The old blacksmith sat in his sturdy rocking chair, placing a hand on Copper's head. The fire danced on the hearth, casting warm shadows over the limestone walls. He remembered the grueling days of digging, the blisters, the cold, and the doubt. But the cellar had proven its worth. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a testament to the old ways, the forgotten knowledge that modern men had so easily discarded. The mountain gives, and the mountain takes. And for those who listen, for those who bleed for it, it provides sanctuary. As the spring birds began their morning song outside the heavy oak door, Jedidiah smiled. The storm was over. The roots had held. When the townsfolk returned to Miller's Hollow, they took with them more than just full bellies. They carried a renewed respect for the wilderness they lived in. They began to rebuild, not with arrogant tin and flimsy pine, but with stout oak and heavy stone. Listening to the lessons Jedidiah had taught them, they learned to read the signs of the woolly bear caterpillars, to appreciate the thick bark on the north side of the trees, and to never, ever underestimate the brutal power of the Appalachian winter. Jedidiah remained on Black Bear Ridge, a quiet guardian of the old ways, his cellar always stocked, his fire always burning, ready for whatever the mountain might throw their way. So, when the wind howls and the sky turns that deep, bruising purple, remember the story of Jedidiah Boone. Remember the calloused hands that built a sanctuary out of a limestone bluff. Remember the quiet faith that endured when the world froze over. And remember that the deepest roots always weather the hardest storms. Stay safe, stay prepared, and never forget the wisdom of the mountains.